Welcome to MedMark's webinar series. Today's presentation is titled Emergency Use Authorization, Be Aware, Be Prepared. I'm Kate Klaus, Senior Attorney at MedMark's Risk Management Department. On behalf of MedMark and today's presenter, Jianling Song, thank you for joining us. Dr. Jianling Song began her professional life as a physician in Beijing, China, which provided her with a solid background and extensive knowledge to represent companies and individual practitioners in the life sciences and healthcare industries after she changed her career path from medicine to law. During her 15-year legal career, Dr. Song has defended manufacturers of a very broad spectrum of life science products, from food supplements and dental adhesives to prescription drugs and medical devices. She also has represented clinical and diagnostic laboratories and dental, medical, and nursing practitioners in professional malpractice cases and in response to investigations by their respective professional boards. Among her many successes, Dr. Song defended a manufacturer of a 3D printed joint prosthesis, obtaining a no liability judgment, which yielded the first published opinion in product liability law involving a 3D printed medical device in the state of California. Dr. Song represents medical, dental, and nursing professionals in medical malpractice lawsuits and investigations. She also consults and represents companies and individuals in employment law disputes. In addition to her litigation practice, Dr. Song regularly advises Chinese companies on U.S. laws and regulations, including FDA, CLIA, and Prop 65 regulations, as well as cannabis laws and regulations. And with that, I am pleased to turn things over to Dr. Song.
Thank you, Kate, for that introduction, and thank you everyone for zooming in. I am really glad to have this opportunity to talk about emergency use authorization, which I do not think we have given these EUAs enough attention as much as they deserve. For one thing, since the beginning of this pandemic, the FDA has issued nearly, if not more than 400 EUAs. And with these EUAs, the FDA has brought into the United States market tens of thousands of medical products, from all of the COVID-19 vaccines to prescription drugs, from diagnostic tools to a wide spectrum of medical devices, much more than ventilators, infusion pumps, and facial masks. When the state of emergency comes to an end, which based on the current declaration from the Department of Health and Human Services, the state of emergency will end in February of next year. When that date comes, all of these EUAs will be terminated, and all of the medical products that came to the market under these EUA authorizations will need to be taken off the market and will need to be disposed of. Not needless to mention that the FDA, while it has been issuing new EUAs on the one hand, it has also been revoking existing EUAs on the other. So as we are getting into the second half of the pandemic, it is really time for us to start learning the laws and regulations governing the EUAs and start discussing what we need to do to be prepared when all these EUAs are terminated or revoked. So with that introduction, let me start the webinar with some background information about EUA. What is an EUA? An EUA, first of all, it is an authorization. It is not a clearance or approval. That signals the different level of evidence and different level of scrutiny from the FDA. So the official definition of EUA is that it is a temporary and expedited pathway as an alternative to the traditional pathways such as 510(k) clearance or pre-market approval that the FDA employs in times of emergency to introduce certain medical products into interstate commerce. And this authorization has two types of status, two types of approving status. One is by approving an unapproved medical product, And the other one is by approving an unapproved use, or in other words, an off-labeled use of an approved medical product. And here I'm using the word approval and authorization in a interchangeably, which is what the FDA has been using. But it is important for us to bear in mind that it is not an official approval, it is an authorization. So just how expedited this pathway that we are talking about. Let me give you an example. In normal years, to develop a vaccine from the beginning of the development, where the FDA will get involved in reviewing every step of the way, to the final approval by the FDA, it would take no less than a few years. However, with respect to Pfizer's COVID-19 vaccine, if I'm not mistaken, from the development of the vaccine to the final approval, it took about 8 months. And the FDA's final approval, after all the data has been have been submitted to the FDA, the agency took less than 2 days to review the data and give the green light to the vaccine. And that is even a lengthy process in terms of EUA authorizations, because it is the first time in history that the FDA ever authorized a vaccine through a temporary and expedited pathway. So the FDA's review on the COVID-19 vaccine was actually going through a so-called EUA plus pathway, not a typical EUA pathway, which means the FDA's EUA review of other medical products, such as facial masks or ventilators, would take much less time than the agency's review of the vaccines. Sometimes the agency took only a few hours to get an EUA authorized. So EUA is really a very powerful and handy pathway for the FDA to cope with the sudden increase of demand and the decrease of supply of medical products in times of emergency. Before EUA was passed into law in 2004, at emergency times before that, the FDA has used different pathways to get products into the market, which were investigational new drug pathways and the investigational device exemptions pathway. However, because of the investigational nature of these pathways, the administration of the medical products were very complicated and limited. Usually the administration of these drugs and devices would require layers of approval from the government agencies and would require the patient's informed consent on every administration. So realizing these limitations, in 2004, after September 11 and during the anthrax threat, the Congress passed what later known as the Eua Statute, which is Section 564 of the Food, Drug, and Cosmetics Act. That statute provides that the secretary, the commissioner of the FDA, may authorize the introduction into interstate commerce during the effective period of a declaration under subsection B of a drug, device, or biological product intended for use in an actual or potential emergency, and which is referred to as an emergency use. The declaration that's referenced in that provision is a declaration that has to be made by the secretary, either the Secretary of the Health and Human Services or the Secretary of the Department of Justice or the Secretary of the Homeland Security, but one of these three secretaries declaring that an emergency state exists to justify the authorization of EUA. So since that time, the FDA has issued EUAs at various emergency states, from the anthrax threat to H1N1 and the MERS, Ebola epidemic, and Zika epidemic. As you can see from this chart, in all of those previous emergency times, the FDA has issued probably less than 20 EUAs. Since the beginning of the COVID-19 emergency, which officially began when the Secretary of the Department of Health and Human Services declared emergency state in February of last year, to this date, the FDA has issued more than 400 EUAs. That is the scale of the issue that we are discussing today. Some introduction of the COVID-19 EUAs. The first EUA was issued on the same day as the Secretary of the HHS declared national emergency. It was a COVID-19 diagnostic panel. And from that time going forward, the FDA has authorized all of the COVID-19 vaccines, drugs and biological therapeutic products, and a very wide spectrum of medical devices, including ventilators, personal protective equipment, in vitro diagnostics, respiratory assist devices, blood purification devices, renal replacement therapy and hemodialysis devices, infusion pumps, wearable monitoring devices, and all sorts of other devices. Some of the notable COVID-19 EUAs, hydrochloroquine and chloroquine. The EUAs of those drugs were issued on March 28, 2020, after President Trump claimed that they were effective in treating COVID-19 patients. Those EUAs, however, were revoked about less than 3 months later after evidence shown to the FDA that their limited effectiveness on COVID-19 would be overweighed by their cardiovascular and other side effects. And remdesivir for treating COVID-19 patients. Remdesivir is really near and dear to my heart. I came from China and I still have a lot of friends from college who are working in hospitals and in pharmaceutical industries in China. And remdesivir was really the very first hope that we saw in the first few months, the darkest time period of this pandemic. I still remember that when remdesivir was first reported being a successful treatment to COVID-19 patients, that was reported by University of Washington. It was a beautifully written case report. And I think that was in February of last year. The patient came from China as well. He traveled from Wuhan and he got a severe type COVID-19. And at that time, remdesivir was used on him as an investigational new drug. As I think some of you may know, remdesivir was developed by Gilead as a drug to treat Ebola virus and hepatitis C virus, but it was proved not to be effective to those viruses. So Gilead had not applied for FDA approval on remdesivir. And after the first treatment using remdesivir on the COVID-19 patient, it was shown to be successful. After that, Gilead published its formulation for remdesivir. So the companies in China could replicate them free of charge to treat more COVID-19 patients. And the Chinese people, to express their gratitude and excitement, they translated the name remdesivir quite phonetically to be people's hope. That's what remdesivir sounds like in Chinese. So that was a short story about remdesivir. And after the first case report came out, remdesivir received FDA's EUA on May 1st, 2020. And that EUA was subsequently revised twice to expand the usage of remdesivir from only treating hospitalized severe type COVID-19 patients to the treatment of all types of COVID-19 patients, if I'm not mistaken. And Gilead went ahead to apply for FDA approval on remdesivir for treating COVID-19 patients. That approval was obtained on October 22, 2020, and on the same date, remdesivir's EUA was revoked. So what are the criteria for the FDA to issue an EUA? That criteria is actually specified in the EUA statute. Of course, the first criteria is that there has to be a life-threatening condition or disease existing to justify such a authorization. But the most important criteria is that it has to be based on the totality of scientific evidence available to the secretary, and it is reasonable for the secretary to believe that the product may be effective in diagnosing, treating, or preventing such disease or condition. You can see that I underlined some of the keywords here: the totality of scientific evidence and reasonable and maybe, because these terms actually indicate the level of evidence the FDA is looking for in an EUA application, which is the FDA does not require some specific evidence as we need to submit in a 510(k) clearance or in a pre-marketing approval. On the other hand, the FDA is looking for any evidence available at the time of the application to indicate, based on a reasonable standard, that this product may be effective. So the standard is quite low in comparison to the traditional clearance or approval review process. And on the other hand, if it comes to litigation, these keywords would signal the level of scrutiny, which is also much lower from the FDA's end in comparison to the traditional clearance or approval pathway, which will mean that it will be even more difficult for us to argue preemption when it comes to litigation. So that is the most important criteria that the FDA holds in their EUA review. And also, of course, the FDA will do a benefit and risk analysis, and the applicants would have to show that the known and potential benefits of this product outweigh the known and potential risks. And the last criteria is that there has to be no adequate, approved, and available alternative to that product for the purpose of that it's specified under the EUA of diagnosing, preventing, and treating COVID-19. And the application of EUA, which is the official term, is a request for consideration for an EUA. What are the data that we need to submit to the FDA for a request for the FDA's consideration of EUA? Unfortunately, that is not specified in the EUA statute. Instead, it is recommended in the FDA's guidance documents. And we all know that, as the FDA itself claims several times repeatedly, that its guidance documents are not law. They are not legally binding. They are only recommendations, but not requirements. However, that doesn't mean that we can afford not following them. We still have to follow them, those guidance documents, to the letter. But it only means that if we get ourselves in trouble in the courtroom, the FDA is not there to cover our back. We're on our own. So I always review the FDA's statement of their guidance documents as the agency's disclaimer of liability. In any regard, their guidance documents says that the request for an EUA consideration can be made either by government agencies or by private entities, the manufacturers, developers, or distribution companies. And the recommended data to submit to the FDA, the categories are quite general. You have to submit a description of your product, of course, and of its intended uses relating to COVID-19. And you have to submit a rationale behind the product's use under an EUA, whatever that means. You have to submit available safety and efficacy data. That is obvious because you have to enable the FDA to do a risk-benefit analysis. And you also need to submit your proposed labeling and instructions for the product's use relating to COVID-19. So these categories of data does not really help us to figure out what exactly we need to submit. But here is the good news, which is during the EUA request and review process, the FDA is very closely communicating with the manufacturers and companies. You can, dial the FDA's number and get them involved at the very beginning. You can ask them questions of what data they would need and, ask them what additional data they would still need from you. Since the beginning of this pandemic, the FDA has been very, very accessible. I have made numerous phone calls to the FDA and they are always there to answer questions. Okay, the duration of an EUA. An EUA will be in effect as long as the declared state of emergency is still in effect, which based on the current declaration, we're good till February of next year. And the EUA will also stay in effect until the FDA revokes it. After the termination or revocation, the use of this medical product on COVID-19 must stop, with just one exception, which is if that use has been on a particular patient and the usage has started before the termination of the medical product, that usage can be continued under the supervision of the treating physician. So termination is straightforward, but what about revocation? The EUA statute actually requires the Secretary of the FDA to periodically review the circumstances and appropriateness of the authorization and make decision to decide whether the EUA needs to be revised or to be revoked. And there are certain criteria for EUA revocation, which includes if the emergency no longer exists, and if the criteria for issuance of the EUA are no longer met. For example, if the FDA has been presented with data to show that that particular product is not that effective in treating COVID-19 after all, like in the case of chloroquine or hydrochloroquine, or the side effects have been shown to overweigh their effectiveness, then that is a criteria for the FDA, an indication for the FDA to revoke the EUA. And of course, there's always this catch-all provision that says if there are other circumstances that makes revision or revocation appropriate. What will happen to your products after the termination of EUA? According to the EUA statute, the product must be disposed of after the EUA terminates. The good thing is, again, the FDA is required to advise the manufacturer or developer of that product as early as possible with respect to the termination of the EUA and to the disposition of the product. And the EUA statute actually requires a reasonably sufficient notice period that the FDA has to give to the companies, that the notice period has to be sufficient for the companies to dispose of their products, and it has to be sufficient. In the alternative, it has to be sufficient for the companies to take off that EUA authorized usage from the product's labeling if the product has otherwise already been approved. However, the EUA statute says nothing about revocation of the EUA, which is even more significant of an issue given that the FDA, since the beginning of, probably since as early as May of last year, has already revoked tens of the EUAs that itself has issued during this pandemic. The FDA has only says in one of its guidance documents that it intends to communicate with the manufacturers. But again, it's the FDA, we cannot hold them on their words, to their words. So the key point here for the companies and their insurers or their attorneys is that we need to keep a very close eye on the FDA's website, and we need to start a communication or keep our communication going with the FDA. And so we can, give ourselves sufficient time to anticipate a revocation of our EUAs. Liability protection. I think most of you know that we have the PrEP Act, which is the Public Readiness and Emergency Preparedness Act of 2005, in place throughout this pandemic to provide almost a blanket tort liability immunity on almost all types of medical countermeasures, medical products that have been used during this pandemic in the preventing, diagnosing, and treating of COVID-19 patients. So the issue is whether EUA authorized products are under this protection, and whether if the EUA terminates or be revoked by the FDA, whether that would deprive the immunity, the PrEP Act immunity protection of those EUA authorized products. There's no clear answer written anywhere. So let's just take a look at what the PrEP Act says. The PrEP Act says that qualified pandemic products are immune from this PrEP Act, from tort liability. And it has a very wide spectrum of persons covered, including all the companies on the distribution chain of that product, as well as the individuals, the professionals who are prescribing or dispensing, administering those medical products. And it covers a wide spectrum of activities from the development, manufacture, testing, distribution, and to the administration and use of those medical products. And it covers pretty much all the medical products that the FDA has authorized to get on the market during the pandemic. And there is only one explicitly stated exception to this coverage, which is when there is willful misconduct found with respect to these medical products. Okay, what does the FDA mean by qualified pandemic or epidemic product? The definition of this qualified pandemic or epidemic product includes any product that the FDA has approved, cleared, or authorized for emergency use, which includes the EUA authorized products. But what about willful misconduct? The definition of willful misconduct is just like the definition of willful misconduct in, generally in the various statutes. It requires some intentional wrongdoing. It requires the knowledge of the lack of legal or factual justifications and the knowledge and disregard of a very high risk of the medical products. The risk has to be as high as it needs to be highly probable that the harm will outweigh the benefit. This is actually a very high standard to prove, and the plaintiff bears the burden of proof by a clear and convincing evidence that willful misconduct existed in the manufacture, development, or administration of this medical product. So when we look at the standard of willful misconduct and the standard of EUA revocation, the criteria of EUA revocation, it's quite obvious that the criteria of EUA revocation fall much lower than the standard to prove willful misconduct. But that doesn't mean that the plaintiff will never prove it, because if we look at the definition of willful misconduct, it actually includes a enforcement action by the federal government. And the enforcement action in turn includes a revocation based on willful conduct of an authorization that's issued under the Eua Statute, which means a EUA authorization. And again, the definition of covered remedy says a revocation of an authority is one of the covered remedy. So although the PrEP Act does not say it explicitly, it sort of signals it everywhere in the statute that a EUA revocation, if based on willful misconduct, will take the product out of the protection of PrEP Act. Again, this slide shows that the revocation standard falls much lower than the willful misconduct standard. For one thing, it doesn't take the finding of some intentional wrongdoing for the FDA to revoke the EUA. So the burden is on the plaintiff. When plaintiff files a claim arguing that the product goes outside of the protection of the PrEP Act, the plaintiff not only must show that the product was revoked, the plaintiff also must show that the revocation was based on willful misconduct. So how do we, without any cases being filed in court, how do we know whether our revocation was or is based on willful misconduct? The first place to look for, the simplest way to find that out, is to look at the FDA's revocation letter. The FDA will issue a letter when it revokes an EUA, and the letter is usually very good indication on what grounds the FDA has issued the revocation. If the letter doesn't say anything indicating willful misconduct, then it's fair to say that we are safe. So there have been no cases filed, or at least there have been no cases published that address the issue of a revoked EUA. So at this point, all of what I just said before was just our analysis on paper. It hasn't been tested by court. So there's no guarantee that the court may look at it in an all different way. So far, there are only 2 cases filed that touched upon a revoked EUA. And unfortunately, neither of these 2 cases actually get into the stage where the court would, address the substantive issue of the EUA revocation. Just by a very, very brief introduction of these 2 cases. The first case was filed by the Association of American Physicians and Surgeons against the FDA. And the injury was that the FDA's revocation of hydrochloroquine deprived or impeded the association's member physicians and surgeons from prescribing that drug to their patients to treat or prevent COVID-19. And the case was dismissed for lack of standing. And the court said that just because, notwithstanding the revocation of the EUA, hydrochloroquine is still a market, and the physicians are free to prescribe them for their off-labeled use of treating COVID-19. So the FDA says that we're not blocking them from prescribing those drugs. Of course, when, if there's any liability arising from the administering of those drugs on COVID-19 patients, we're not protecting them either. So that's the first case. The second case was filed by an individual plaintiff pro se without legal representation. The plaintiff argued that because of the FDA revoked EUA of hydroxychloroquine, he and his father had to undergo, without that drug, they had to undergo illegal house arrest, which is his way of saying house quarantine. So they are suing the FDA and they want the court to issue a TRO to stop the FDA from revoking these drugs. The court dismissed the case for failure to show irreparable harm. And the court said that as long as the majority of the American people have to undergo the same house arrest, the same house quarantine during this pandemic, your specific claimed injury is not that outstanding. So that is a brief overview of the laws and regulations of the EUA and what we are predicting, without any confirmation by the court of the legal implications of after the EUAs are terminated or revoked. So back to our take-home message. What do we need to do as companies, manufacturers, or developers, and as their insurers and as their attorneys? What do we need to do in preparation for the revocation or termination of our EUAs? A few things. One is we need to keep very close monitoring of the FDA's EUA list to see if any similar products, similar to our products, got their EUAs revoked, or if the FDA has stopped updating the effective date of our EUA, that may be a signal of the FDA's intention to revoke the EUA. And of course, the most effective way is to engage in communication with the FDA as early as possible. And also, we need to keep very clear labeling and complete documentation, as complete as possible, of the EUA-authorized products, so we can keep track of their marketing status and also keep track of their shipments and distributions. When these EUAs are terminated or revoked, we can very effectively recall all of our products. And to that end, we also need to start formulating a recall strategy as soon as possible. And of course, on a practical level, we need to consider the alternatives to product destruction. Just because we are required to take those products off the market does not mean that we need to destroy all of those good products. We need to start thinking about the alternatives. And one of the alternatives is that if we want to keep the products on the market, we need to start preparing to apply either of the traditional pathways, either a 510K clearance or a PMA approval for those products. And there are a lot of publications by the FDA and by various agencies working with the FDA on, giving you different various lists of things that the companies need to do. So it helps to start researching, get our research on the way to prepare, to help us to as best prepared as possible. And with that, I'm opening to any questions you may have.
Thank you very much. We do have a few questions from our listeners. First, could you talk a bit about how the issue of preemption might play out in liability claims against EUA authorized products if the products were to lose immunity under the PrEP Act?
Okay, that is a very good question. I will answer it to the best that I can, because so far nothing has been played out in court yet. But as I said in my a few slides ago, based on the level of scrutiny that the FDA has employed on this EUA review process, it is even lower, much lower than 510K clearance scrutiny. So I myself am not very optimistic in the argument of preemption in the case of EUAs. If we do get there, if we lose PrEP Act immunity, preemption is going to be a very tough battle to fight, especially in states like California. You know, if the court does not believe preemption should be in place for products that are cleared under the 510K pathway, it is really hard to convince the court that products authorized under this temporary pathway would enjoy preemption. But that doesn't mean that there's no argument there. At least, you know, I think the FDA has expressed its intention that EUA authorization should preempt local state requirements if those requirements are different than the requirements spelled out under the EUA authorization. But again, that's no guarantee of that the court will see it the same way.
Thank you. I know you touched on this a little bit, but could you speak to the different levels of scrutiny that FDA applies when they are reviewing EUA products or EUA applications for products?
Without getting into much specifics, I think, you know, it's fair to say that the FDA's review, the standard of review on the EUA authorizations is very much a case-by-case basis. It varies from each product. Like I said, on the vaccines, the FDA had employed a EUA plus standard of review. However, you know, other class 2 medical devices such as ventilators, the FDA's review probably varied from days to, you know, from 1 day to a few days. And on the class 1 medical products, such as facial masks or other personal protective equipments, it was really the matter of hours for the FDA to issue their EUA. So it has to be it depends on the specific product. And also, of course, if the product is not EUA FDA approved before, that would take the FDA much longer time and much more data to authorize the EUA than if you are only requesting an indication to be added to the labeling of a already approved or cleared medical product. I hope that answers your question.
Thank you. And a question with regard to post-marketing obligations. Are there differences in the requirements between EUA authorized products versus products approved through the traditional pathways?
Yes, there are. Another really good question and very practical point. There are differences in the post-marketing regulatory compliances in EUA authorized products. For one thing, the FDA, the Eua Statute actually explicitly says that the good manufacturing practice may be waived in certain cases, in certain EUA authorized products. And I think, during the pandemic, the FDA suspended on-site inspections of the manufacturers. I'm not exactly clear whether that inspection has been reinstated yet, but I wouldn't be surprised if the FDA has relaxed the inspection requirements on the EUA authorized products as well. Again, it is case by case situation, and the FDA issues a requirements on each EUA authorized product. So all the requirements, pre-marketing and post-marketing, will be spelled out on that EUA notification on the FDA's publication. And again, we always have the option to communicate with the FDA to find out whether there are any other standards that they will waive on our products undergoing the EUA authorization. So the quick answer is yes, the post-marketing requirements are relaxed.
Okay, and one last question. Will manufacturers of EUA products, like the major vaccine manufacturers, would they file parallel traditional vaccine applications? And if so, how long would that process be expected to take?
I cannot speak for the vaccine manufacturers because I have not come to learn whether they filed parallel approval. I cannot imagine that they haven't. It would be, they have all the reason to file a parallel application. But in terms of medical products, medical devices, I know some manufacturers chose to go both ways. It definitely takes longer for the FDA to approve or clear your medical product through a traditional pathway, and your EUA request does not facilitate that process. It's not because the FDA has authorized your request on the EUA. That doesn't mean that the FDA will expedite the review process of your product under 510K or under pre-marketing approval. So whatever time it takes, it actually, during the pandemic, it may take the FDA longer time to go through the traditional pathway, for obvious reasons. The FDA receives tens of thousands of EUA requests every day. So they have limited resources to assign to the traditional pathway. I guess the quick answer is that it will take whatever time it will take in normal times for the FDA to approve your product through a traditional pathway.
Thanks very much, Dr. Song. This is a very timely and interesting subject, and I know that your presentation will be of great value to our audience.
Thank you. I'm really glad, and thank you for having me here.
Thank you for joining us. This concludes today's webinar.
Thanks, everyone.